All right, for MIDI Project 2, we're going to program a drum groove only with a percussion track. And I just thought it would be good to show you an actual drum set. And the idea is to try to model what we program in the sequencer after real drums. Obviously, not all music, uses real drum set, but I think it's good to have that history and understanding of where that comes from, the idea of drumming, the way drummers play, the names of the drums. So we'll start with this, an acoustic kit, kind of demonstrate how a drummer would play, and then hopefully that will kind of make its way into your programming when you get into the DAW. So let's start with just the names of the drums. And we're going to start at the bottom. So we have the kick drum or the bass drum. And kind of like the name suggests, we play it with our foot, and we're going to use the kick pedal. And then kind of working our way up from, in a groove sense, probably the snare drum would be the next item. So it's called a snare drum because it actually has wires on the bottom. If you can see right there, that vibrate. And if you don't have those turned on, it just sounds like a tom-tom. But if I turn on the snare drum, or the snares, then you get that snare sound. It's got all that snap and bite to it. So that's why it's called a snare drum. All right, kick drum, snare drum. Hi-hat would probably be next. And the hi-hat is two cymbals that come together that you can play with your foot, or you can play with a stick, or you can sort of combine those things and play with a stick, but also open with the foot. Or sometimes if you're playing with your right hand somewhere else on the drum set, you can be playing time and still open and close the hi-hat with your foot. So it adds just another layer of sound to the way the drum set sounds in a groove, maybe closing the hi-hat in 2 and 4. Probably next in line in terms of like mix order in a session would be to go around the toms. So the toms that you see here, I've got kind of too many of them, but normally there would just probably be 2 over the drum kit. And we call these the rack toms or the tom-toms, or tom 1, tom 2. And then the one that's over here we call the floor tom because it literally sits on the floor. So we can have, like in my case, tom 1, tom 2, tom 3, and then floor tom, right? And we use these sometimes for fills, or in certain grooves you might play on them kind of more regularly. But it's a sound source, it's a different voice. And to the extent that a drummer wants to be kind of melodic in their playing, they can incorporate this sort of pitch of the tom-toms into their playing, and it can be a really cool thing. Finally, up top, we have the cymbals, and I just have 2 up today, keeping it simple. Over here, we have a crash cymbal, right? And the crash cymbal, primarily, we use to accentuate or to land somewhere. It's kind of an exclamation point in the groove or at the end of a fill. Sometimes drummers will play on them constantly, right? Like in a rock tune, you might literally just play on the crash. But typically, it's just kind of used for an accent or a punch. Over here, we have a larger cymbal, which is usually thicker, and it's called the ride cymbal. And this one is meant to be played over and over again. You kind of ride it, and it sounds a little bit different. And in addition to playing on the cymbal, you can move your stick up to the bell. That's kind of a cool sound. And you can crash it as well. You can play, any way you like on any of the cymbals, but typically you kind of play this one as a pattern, and this one you use as more of an accent or an exclamation point. So those are the basic parts of the drum kit. For the purposes of this class, we're going to say that those things that I just showed you are the drum set: kick, snare, hi-hat, toms, floor tom, and the cymbals. And anything else we're going to consider to be percussion. I do have a cowbell mounted on this drum kit, but let's just call that percussion, and that can be in the family of hand drums and all kinds of different sound making devices. But just to keep it simple, and also the way the drums lay on the keyboard in a MIDI mapping situation, the drum set is really one unit, and it takes up just one specific area of the keys on a keyboard. Okay? All right, so I just want to show a little bit of the technique or the different sounds that you can make on a drum kit, and I'm going to start with probably the most interesting one, which is the snare drum. So you can play the snare drum and just hit it, but you can also get some different sounds, and I just want to show you what those sound like and also what they're called. So probably the next most obvious one is called a cross stick. And the cross stick involves usually turning the stick over to the fat part, and I'm going to lay it on the surface of the snare drum like this, and I'm going to hit the rim with the fat part of the stick, and I'm kind of palming the head of the drum with my left hand. So it's kind of a cool sound. Sometimes we heard this in country music or in a ballad. You want the backbeat, but you don't want it to be so big that you're playing the snare drum on every 2 and 4. So that's kind of a cool sound. Right? There's one more, which is called the rim shot. And the rim shot means that you're going to play the snare drum on the head, but you're going to simultaneously hit the rim with the stick. So this is one that takes a little bit of practice. And for myself, I know it's really important that the drums are set up kind of comfortably in terms of height. The snare drum has to be the right height. My seat has to be the right height. And usually after a while, I kind of get used to the position and I can hit that rim shot just about every time. It's very powerful sound. It's something you would use maybe in a rock or funk groove where you want that extra emphasis on the 2 and 4 from the snare drum. So it's got a loud crack. It's really powerful. And it sounds like this. In a groove. Regular snare drum. With the rim shot. So you can hear it's got a little extra something just to make it sound a little bit, meatier and have a little bit more emphasis on the 2 and 4. Real quick, on the hi-hat, I mentioned that you can play it with your foot or with the stick. The openings can be a really cool tool to sort of vary or change up the sound of a groove. So if I play a simple 8th note groove, and I just open the hi-hat, you can add some extra flavor to the groove like this. So we'll talk about how to program that in MIDI. It involves using the open hi-hat, which is a B flat on the keyboard, and then programming it so that it will close again when the next closed hi-hat, which is F sharp 1, comes on the MIDI timeline. But again, it's a really cool way to make it sound a little bit more drummer-like when you're programming drums. So the same thing applies to the toms. You can actually play rim shots on the toms. But I really wanted to cover those sounds of the snare drum because that's probably the most versatile drum in terms of being able to do different sounds on the snare drum. All right, so for this next example, I'm just going to play a very simple 8th note groove. And I just want to show you what the backbeat is. So if we're counting 4 beats to a bar, like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The 2 and the 4 are considered the backbeat of the groove, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I would like for you to use a backbeat in this groove that you create. You can phrase other things around it, but that insistent, very dependable 2 and 4 is going to help kind of lock the groove down so that the listener kind of knows what's going on. So we want to use a backbeat on 2 and 4. The kick drum normally plays on 1 at least, maybe 1 and 3, but you can get creative with sort of phrasing the kick drum and doing different patterns to try to change the groove and make it sound interesting, maybe even when you go from the first 8 bars to the second 8 bars, right? So here's just a couple of different bass drum variations that you could try to change up the feel of the 8th note groove. So the other thing that I added to the last example was something called a ghost note. And a ghost note is a really soft note that you play usually on the snare drum. And it's like a filler in between the groove that gives it this sense of like momentum and kind of keeps the subdivisions going. So let me just give you a little bit more of ghost notes in the left hand. And you can program this in MIDI. You just have to make the notes really quiet. And what it does is it kind of helps make the groove feel a little bit, funkier, I guess I would say. Right, so that changes completely the way things feel in the groove just by adding some of those upbeats played on the snare drum or the ghost notes. My last example is going to be creating 8-bar grooves, 8-measure grooves that include drum fills and then pattern changes at 8-bar intervals. So the idea is to play compositionally, to play a drum set groove that feels like a song, even though still there's no song, right? But we want to feel the pattern of a song, even in the drum set groove. So I'm going to attempt to play 8 bars, and then 8 bars, 8 bars, and 8 bars, changing the feel, playing a drum fill, and setting up the next section so that we have the expectation of change, and then we get the payoff of change once we arrive in the new section, all right? 1, 2,